This is Claude Monet's painting of bathers at La Grenouillère, a popular place for rest and relaxation on the River Seine near Bougival, just to the west of Paris. It's an early example of the approach to painting that became known as Impressionism, capturing the fleeting effect of light on water in a scene from contemporary life. Monet painted this view in 1869. Well over a century later, it's still very evocative. I can almost feel the cool shade of the trees, contrasted with the bright sunlight glinting off the open water of the river. It's not hard to imagine the flirtatious conversation taking place between these figures on the jetty. The women's poses, sketched in with just a few strokes of the brush, let us know that they're confident players of this particular social game. The theme of bathers is one that attracted many leading painters in late 19th century France. As a subject that artists have represented for centuries, it served as a kind of touchstone, a classic theme involving both landscape and the human form that each artist could make their own. The National Gallery in London has two more particularly important representations of people swimming or resting by water from this period. One is Georges Seurat's huge picture from 1884 of young men bathing in the Seine, this time in the industrial suburb of Asnières. Seurat's painting suggests none of the busy chatter and playful splashes of Monet's scene. Instead, it seems almost unnaturally still, as the sun beats down on skin, grass and water that has been represented with an incredibly complex range of colours and brushstrokes. Different again is Paul Cézanne's version of a bather's scene, made between about 1900 and 1906. This doesn't look like any particular location. Indeed, some might say that these don't look that much like real people either. They seem almost to grow out of the landscape, their bodies arranged like the strata of rocks, echoing the lines of tree trunks. These bathers are reduced to forms that have been constructed from cones and cylinders, painted in geometric patches of colour. So, we have three paintings on the same subject, made by French artists within a period of about 30 years, but they look so different from each other, and like nothing else here in the National Gallery. They do, though, have one thing in common, apart from the fact that they all depict bathers. Each artist felt that with this work, he was doing something truly modern. This seems to have been a concept that had particular currency for some French artists during the late 19th century, in a way that it never had before. But what exactly did making a modern painting mean for Monet, Seurat and Cézanne? What can their work tell us about the huge changes that took place in French art at this time, including Impressionism and other new creative departures? Let's start by looking at Monet's Bathers at La Grenouillère in a bit more detail. What was modern about this for Monet?
Monet was drawn to La Grenouillère because it was a modern bathing place on the banks of the Seine that people could get to very easily by train from the Gare Saint-Lazare. And on weekends it was an incredibly popular place to meet people, to have a meal, to swim, just to wander around and see who was there. What's modern about the painting is the way in which he's trying to capture the effect of light falling on water by using a very broken brushstroke technique and by abbreviating the drawing, the description, as much as possible. Monet is showing how this bathing theme brought together all kinds of very different people, people of very different classes. So this is, I think, summed up in the encounter between the gentleman, who is wearing traditional kind of street clothes, as it were, and the women, who are very evidently not ladies, who are wearing their black woolen bathing suits. And of course no respectable woman would have appeared in public in her bathing suit. And we only need to think about what those black bathing suits were like when they were wet to realize that they were extremely revealing. And he captures this little encounter in a way that reminds us that he was a caricaturist before he was a painter, especially the one woman with her hand on her hip, which he does in such a shorthand and with such wit and enthusiasm that it's a really lively rendering of a contemporary encounter.
Monet's scene of contemporary bathers does look very different to some of the art that had been produced in France in recent years, particularly paintings that express the ideals promoted by official French artistic institutions. Bodies like the École des Beaux-Arts and the Academy were very powerful, deciding whose work would be shown at the huge annual Salon exhibitions. Success here had traditionally been vital for an up-and-coming artist's career. So, did your work need to look like this to gain approval?
What the academics were looking for in their pictures was a kind of high finish, the invisibility of the brushstroke, so that it was the surface of the painting itself, almost like an enamel that shone through. Still in the 19th century, you had the lingering of the hierarchy of genres, of types of painting, and history painting, great stories from history for the academic painters, were the ideal. The art establishment very much valued anything that showed technical skill. So high finish in a painting, evidence of great talent in drawing, all of these things were held in high esteem.
Ingres was an important figure in French art during the first half of the 19th century, becoming the director of the Academy. The subjects that interested him most were themes from classical mythology or literature, which gave him the opportunity to connect with ideas and art from the past. This scene shows Angelica saved from a sea monster by Ruggiero, an episode from the Italian Renaissance writer Ariosto's epic poem Orlando Furioso. We can see Ingres' interest in line in the way that he has painted Angelica's smooth, pale body, head lolling back in a strangely unnatural pose as she appears to swoon amidst the drama of her rescue. The artist used the same focus on line and highly polished painting techniques when he made portraits, something he very much disliked but which he sometimes had to do in order to support himself financially. He only agreed to make this portrait of Madame Mortecier because he was so struck by her beauty. The sitter's unusual pose is taken from an ancient wall painting unearthed at Herculaneum, which shows a goddess. In Ingres' painting, Madame Mortecier becomes a modern version of Flora, goddess of fertility and abundance. Even though this shows a woman who was very much alive when the picture was made, this is a painting that looks back to the past too. It's also an incredibly detailed painting. It took Ingres 12 years to complete. When you compare the surface of this painting with Monet's Bathers at La Grenouillère, you can see how utterly unalike they are. If the art establishment was used to the idea that paintings should connect with the past, and that they should have clean lines and a minutely finished, smooth surface, you can see how Monet's painting might have come as a bit of a shock. But we should be careful about seeing developments in late 19th century French art, particularly Impressionism, in terms of crude oppositions of mainstream and rebel artists. Nor should we assume that avant-garde artists simply headed off in a new direction with no reference at all to the past. The reality of what happened was more complex and subtle than that, and far more interesting.
Artists throughout the 19th century worked against the academic grain. One of the most important is Eugène Delacroix, who right from the beginning of his career was interested in brighter colors, greater freedom of brushstroke, and a much more evident painterly hand in his pictures. The Impressionists saw in Delacroix somebody who had been doing what they wanted to do, that is to liberate their brushstroke, use brighter color, and have greater freedom to paint quickly.
From the middle of the century, we find French painters who were increasingly interested in depicting subjects that weren't usually deemed worthy of representation in finished oil paintings, like agricultural workers. Millet used energetic brushwork to give form to this winnower, who skillfully flicks a golden mound of threshed wheat into the air, so that the chaff will blow away, leaving the grain in his basket. When the critic Gautier saw this painting in 1848, the year that revolution swept across continental Europe, he wrote enthusiastically that it had everything it takes to horrify the bourgeois. Courbet was another artist who was only too happy to challenge his viewers' expectations and assumptions. He did his own updated version of the Bathers' theme in 1857, giving it the rather ironic title of Young Ladies on the Bank of the Seine. The knowing look of the girl in the foreground and the mountain of petticoats that she displays for us to see suggests even to our eyes now that this is probably no young lady. Visitors to the Salon exhibition of 1857, who saw a larger version of this work, were certainly under no illusions about what kind of girls these were. The painting caused a scandal. Courbet had dispensed with the usual generalised mythological setting that would have sealed his erotically available young women into an imaginary world. Their realism made many viewers distinctly uncomfortable. Perhaps ironically, some of the work that was seen as the most unconventional and shocking of the 1860s was produced by an artist who in fact always craved acceptance from the art establishment, Edouard Manet. His work would be of crucial importance for the Impressionists. In this representation of fashionable Parisians gathered in the Tuileries Gardens to hear an outdoor concert, he's included a portrait of himself. He's here at the edge of the painting.
Manet's aim was both to be modern and to look to the past, so to balance between being incredibly involved with the contemporary, the here and now, and also to show his admiration for the art of the past. One of the key features of his technique is how he lights his paintings. He lights them from the front, so that what happens is that the features of figures become very flattened. They create almost a mask-like effect, and it's quite different from the more usual way of lighting a painting from the side. It's always said that what Manet does with colour is to eliminate the half-tones, so that you get very extreme contrasts between one tone and another. In other words, he doesn't blend the tones so that you can have a nice harmonious whole. You get much more of a jagged feel, and he's trying to create that sense of fracturing and jaggedness that's part of his concept of modernity. Manet was just slightly older than the Impressionists, and they saw him as somebody who'd broken the ground before them in his desire to be modern, in his desire to explore what that meant, and to create that kind of balance between modern and traditional.
Manet included political subject matter in his representations of contemporary life. These fragments are from the second of 3 huge canvases that he painted in the late 1860s, showing the execution of Emperor Maximilian. He had been installed as a puppet ruler in Mexico by the French government, who then withdrew their troops and abandoned him to his fate at the hands of the Mexicans. The artist has visualized this dramatic scene in terms of broad shapes and areas of colour rather than minute details. He has still, however, worked from life. When he found out that the uniforms of the Mexican firing squad looked similar to those of the French army, Manet posed a group of soldiers commanded by a friend of his in order to make his image believable. This also strengthens the implication that it is the French who are effectively carrying out this death sentence. The critic and novelist Émile Zola wrote that Manet had created a new form for the new subject, and it's this new form which terrifies everyone. In the case of the Maximilian paintings, the subject matter was also cause for concern. Manet was not allowed to exhibit his final version of the scene, and the government censor ordered that the lithograph print that he'd made of it be destroyed. This version stayed in his studio, later on cut up first by the artist and then by his family. We get a sense of just how different Manet's approach was if we compare his depiction of the Tuileries with a representation of the same park by the German artist Adolf Menzel. This was made in direct response to Manet's canvas, which Menzel saw in Paris when it was shown in one of the artist's independent exhibitions. He starts with a direct quotation from the French painting, this standing man wearing a top hat. However, whilst Manet represented modern life as an indistinct, rather disquieting blur that resists the viewer's attempt to bring it into focus, Menzel made an eloquent case for the possibilities of a more detailed naturalistic approach to contemporary subject matter. The social melting pot of the gardens is delineated by a range of brilliantly captured characters, their lives playing out across the foreground. Menzel visited Paris to find out what was new in the city that was seen across Europe, and indeed from as far away as America, as the art scene to watch. No doubt he'd heard about a group of young artists who were taking Manet's lead in a different direction. They would come to be known as the Impressionists. Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Sisley, Degas, Cézanne and Berthe Morisot were all key figures. They were never an organised group or movement, but they did have some shared interests and came together at different points to work and to exhibit their paintings during the 1870s and 1880s. Many of these artists were fascinated by the challenge of trying to represent the visual effects that they experienced every day: sunlight, wind, rustling leaves and sparkling water. This is Sisley's view of people fishing by the River Seine at Sèvres. You can almost feel the stiff breeze that's whipping across the scene. Here, Renoir has painted a different view of the river, this time on a baking hot day. He's captured the effect of the air shimmering in the heat and seems to have given as much visual importance to the reflections in the water as he has to the solid objects on and around it. Other painters were drawn to scenes from urban life. How do you capture the sensations evoked by being in a crowded bar, served by blank-eyed waitresses? In this scene, Manet has focused on the setting of the Café Concert, a new kind of establishment where you could take refreshment whilst being entertained by singers, dancers and acrobats. In this painting, Degas has switched the focus to the performer, Miss Lala. Her powerful jaws allowed her to be suspended by her teeth alone. The artist has chosen a dizzying viewpoint so that we look up at her as if we are floating somewhere in mid-air, in a far more precarious position than Miss Lala herself. This was to be modern life painted in a modern way.
In the early years, capturing the immediacy of a view or an atmospheric effect was of prime importance. This meant working outside the studio on location whenever possible. The French phrase for this is en plein air, in the open air.
Some landscape painters had already made outdoor sketching central to their practice, in particular a community of artists working in the countryside around Barbizon, in the forest of Fontainebleau. Corot was associated with this group and often worked out of doors. He painted this view of Avignon from the west in the late 1830s, several decades before Monet and his peers were at work. The Leaning Tree Trunk is another work by Corot. It seems clearly to have originated from a direct encounter with nature. However, Corot's finished works were always made back in the studio, reconstructed memories of what he'd seen outside. Monet, on the other hand, made this small painting sitting on the beach at Trouville in northern France, easily accessible by train for tourists from Paris. It actually has grains of sand embedded in the paint surface, so must have been made at least partly outside. It was painted in 1870, when Monet was on his honeymoon. It features his wife Camille in the white dress, along with Madame Boudin, the wife of a painter whose own landscapes had influenced Monet. Eugène Boudin's views of fashionable visitors at Trouville show an interest in atmospheric effects and delicate broken brushwork that Monet would develop further. He owns several of Boudin's scenes, including this one. In Monet's painting, we see that he has used a daring composition, pushing his figures to the sides of the canvas to leave an unexpected gap in the centre of the picture. The artist plays with shapes, particularly the spiked curves of the parasols and contrasting areas of light, dark and colour.
This small work is one of several on this theme, and Monet may originally have intended it as a preparatory work for a larger painting that he planned to submit to the official Salon exhibition. His decision in the end to consider such small, sketchy works as finished may in part have been an act of artistic rebellion, but it may also have been for more practical financial considerations. The large, costly works that he did submit to the Salon were a huge drain on his financial resources, which were limited. He must have wondered whether it was worth it, especially when they met with little critical success.
Camille Pissarro had similar interests to Monet in the late 1860s, focusing on landscape subjects. He painted this view from the village of Louveciennes between 1869 and 1870. There is nothing grand or sublime about the scene that he has chosen, and he's selected a viewpoint which gives far greater emphasis to the plain road than to the more picturesque remains of the Marly Aqueduct in the background. Perhaps as a result, the blossom on the trees seems particularly dazzling. Renoir and Monet were also working in this area at the time. All three artists threw themselves into capturing the effect of the countryside around them. Later that year, Pissarro and Monet would both find themselves in London, having left Paris to seek refuge from the devastation of the Franco-Prussian War. Monet was captivated by the effects of mist and fog that he witnessed in London, as we see from this view of the Thames below Westminster. This is also, though, modern London. Boats work the river, we see the newly built embankment at the right, and a rough wooden pier dominates the foreground, much more visible than the Houses of Parliament behind. The pier sets up a grid of dark lines whose shapes are echoed throughout the painting. It reminds us that although Monet was interested in capturing atmospheric effects quickly in paint, he was still concerned about the structure of each scene that he chose to represent. His paintings were always carefully thought out and viewpoints selected very much with solid compositional aims in mind. Some critics would later argue that painting what you saw in front of you was so simple that anyone could do it. Émile Porcheron sneered that all you had to do was to buy a box of paints, a canvas and the necessary accessories, sit yourself in front of some landscape or other, put down as well as you can what you see, and Impressionism will have a new recruit. However, if you look carefully at the way that shapes have been placed in these paintings, you'll see that they're often a lot more complex than Porcheron realised. It might look effortless, but that doesn't mean that these were simple effects to achieve. While Monet worked in central London, Pissarro focused on the suburbs. He painted Fox Hill and Upper Norwood on a winter day. This view of the avenue in Sydenham was made in the spring of 1871. It's still recognisable if you visit the area today. While its aim certainly seems to have been to capture the fresh effect of the landscape on a crisp sunny day, we know that this painting wasn't in fact made in one sitting. The figures have been added on top of dry paint, so Pissarro had at least 2 sessions working on this scene. Wasn't such a working practice contrary to what these artists were trying to achieve?
When we study Impressionist paintings with our technical methods, we're interested in several things. Firstly, we're interested in the materials they used, but we're also interested in the surfaces that they were trying to achieve, how they used paint textures, the sheer variety of the way in which they applied oil paint to primed canvas. Sometimes the Impressionists achieved an entire painting at one sitting. They just sat down in the open air, painted a painting, and it was finished. But that's rather unusual, and quite often when we examine a painting, we see the initial lay and the initial working, which they did in that first campaign, but then we see overlaid on the original brush strokes, we see later strokes sometimes when the paint is completely dry. The Impressionists were using some conventional and traditional pigments and materials, but of course many new colours were coming out of the chemical industry in the 19th century, and the discovery of chromium in the late 18th century, for example, unleashed a whole range of new colours. But it was not only the actual pigments that were important, they were able to manipulate colours in different ways. For example, it's well known that the Impressionists benefited from having oil paint in tubes rather than the small bladders that had been used up until the beginning of the 19th century. So the materials were easily transportable out into the open air in small colour boxes that they could take with them. And of course the Impressionists used different sorts of brushes to their predecessors. Up until then, brushes had been made using sections of quill, so it meant they had a round section. But with a metal ferrule, you could make a wide, flat brush that allowed a different sort of paint stroke. And so everywhere in Impressionist paintings, we see this sort of new stroke appearing because they had access to these different sorts of brushes.
Back in France, Monet settled in the north at Argenteuil, but made frequent trips to his hometown of Le Havre. He made several paintings of the harbour there in 1873, including this view looking across to the museum. It was another of these harbour scenes that would provoke the comment that gave these artists their collective name. When the critic Louis Leroy saw the sketchy painting entitled Impression Sunrise in an independent exhibition mounted by Monet and his friends, he sneered that these were indeed mere impressions, not paintings at all.
Despite such negative connotations, or perhaps because of them, as they were good for publicity, the artists embraced their new name. They used it as an identifying feature, particularly when they held exhibitions of their work, which different formulations of the group did from 1874 onwards. This move was born out of frustration at the struggle to get their paintings included in the official salon, which was held at the Louvre behind me,
until the mid-1850s, when it moved to the Palais de l'Industrie, which was later demolished.
Even if you did get in, your painting would be one of perhaps 7,000 works on show. In a small independent exhibition, it was much easier to make your painting visible.
Pissarro's densely painted view of the Côte des Bœufs at l'Ermitage, near Pontoise, was shown at the third Impressionist exhibition. A grid of trees locks the composition into place, but it's the surface of the painting, covered in tiny touches of colour, that really stands out. It's only after you've looked at this picture for a while that you realise that there are two people coming out of the woods to the left of the house. Monet's painting of the railway station of Saint-Lazare was one of the works shown at the 4th exhibition in 1877. He had rented a studio near the station and made several studies of the space, fascinated by the air filled with steam and smoke. He was rumoured to have persuaded the station master to orchestrate the letting off of steam by several trains at the same moment, so that he could observe the dramatic effect of the vaporous clouds inside the imposing structure of the building. This is Berthe Morisot's representation of fashionable women enjoying a boating trip on a summer's day, made in around 1879 and probably shown in the 5th Impressionist exhibition in 1880. The energetic brushstrokes imply a rapid working technique. It looks almost as if Morisot has painted some of her friends, capturing the effect of a leisurely afternoon on the water. These women were probably, however, professional models. They appear in other paintings by Morisot. Painting modern life was about creating a believable illusion and wasn't always based directly on actual, unmediated real life.
The critical and public reaction to these exhibitions was decidedly mixed, although it was never so universally hostile as the myth of the Impressionist rebels would have us believe. There were always some openly negative judgments. Paintings were derided as palette scrapings uniformly laid upon a dirty canvas, or as an assault upon artistic high principles, upon the cult of form and respect for the masters. Other commentators, however, were far more enthusiastic. Jules Castagnari exclaimed, "There is nothing tedious and banal about these young people's approach to understanding nature. It's lively, brisk, light, captivating."
Paul Cézanne did not always attract such positive reviews. He was something of an outsider, coming from the south of France with a strong regional accent and manners that some Parisians found rather rough and ready.
Cézanne was, by all accounts, rather difficult, rather taciturn. He liked to be off by himself. He did not like being with many people. And Gerald Kelly, the British painter who met him near the end of his life, said he smelled a bit. The stove in the studio is, on one hand, a very realistic depiction of what a rather run-down artist studio was like, but it is more than just reportage. It's almost like a self-portrait of the artist, of all the things that are important to him, particularly the big canvas leaning against the wall. It's from this that he will generate his art. So we're meant to see more than a corner of the studio. We're meant to see a life. From about the 1880s on, a small group of critics and fellow artists realized that Cézanne was on a very exciting, vital new path and praised him to the sky. It took the more conventional critics a very long time to catch up to that, and they really didn't do so until after his death.
An even more unlikely participant in the Impressionist exhibitions was Edgar Degas. As this small sketch of two men discussing a newspaper in the Café Chateaudun shows, he was certainly interested in themes from modern life. This was made sometime between 1869 and 1871. However, Degas' training, working methods and approach to art couldn't have been more different to that of his Impressionist contemporaries. He had spent several years in Italy in the late 1850s, copying old master paintings and antique sculpture. His painting of young Spartans exercising, begun perhaps as early as 1860 and then reworked by him over the next 20 years, is unashamedly a history painting, looking back to ancient Sparta for a scene that explores the battle of the sexes. Degas has used models for some of his figures, but has based others on sculptures that he'd studied in Italy. His painting is steeped in tradition and makes conscious references to the art of the past. Degas scorned the idea of painting outside, saying that in his view, artists should be kept indoors by the threat of a whiff of grape shot. He showed this beach scene at the 3rd Impressionist exhibition in 1877, and it certainly doesn't capture a particular moment. There are no shadows, and the smoke from the ships on the horizon is being blown in opposite directions, unlikely in real life. Again, Degas made references to ancient sculpture, as well as using studies made from models. When he was asked how he'd captured this scene, he explained, "It was quite simple. I spread my flannel vest on the floor of the studio and had the model sit on it. He made the point that all art is artificial, the product of a painter's skill and imagination. To pretend otherwise was, in his view, pointless.
By the end of the 1880s, the impetus to continue group exhibitions was no longer there. The work of these artists had never stood still, and by this point it was moving in very different directions. The exhibitions had served their purpose of drawing attention to individual artists, many of whom now had established relationships with dealers who would help to promote their work.
Degas in particular had become increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of exhibiting under the group title of Impressionists, arguing successfully for the more general title of Independent Artists used for the last two shows. His work was certainly unlike anyone else's. Complex compositions that were rich with both colour and illusion, reworked until every mark, every angle was exactly as he wanted it. This is Degas' portrait of Hélène Rouard, made in around 1886. She was the daughter of a friend, someone he'd known since she was a little girl. Degas was fascinated by her fiery hair, tied back here to match her suitably sombre dress and sad expression. Hélène's mother had recently died, and she stands both hemmed in by and clinging on to an empty chair that had come from her mother's family. Degas increasingly restricted his work to a narrow range of favourite subjects, like women's bodies held in tension, which he approached from all sorts of angles and in many different media. Female bathers and dancers were often the focus for his work, and his techniques became increasingly experimental.
About halfway through his career, Degas switched in a rather dramatic way from oil painting, which was his method of expression in the early part of his career, to pastel. And he developed pastel in very innovative ways. And one of the most obvious things he did was to build pastels with various bits of paper. For example, the woman drying herself that we have here in the National Gallery starts on a couple of pieces of paper in the centre of the composition with a very tight drawing of the woman. But then Degas decides to extend it to the right and up and down. But of course this is a very difficult thing to do while you're actually working on a pastel. So he had to take the original pastel, the original drawing, plus all these extra pieces of paper to a specialist mounter of photographs and drawings. And that mounter would very carefully join all the pieces of paper together, and then Degas would carry on with the work in its enlarged form.
Even an action as mundane as having your hair combed could provide Degas with a motif to be endlessly explored. In his beach scene, the young girl calmly submits to her maid's gentle action. In this painting from 1896, the gesture has become much more highly charged. The hot red colouring and the gesture of the woman bracing the roots of her hair against the maid's pull add a sense of both pain and eroticism to the painting. Renoir's work was rarely so dramatic, but he would follow Degas' lead in becoming increasingly interested in what he could learn from the art of the past. We can see from his early paintings that he sometimes had problems with drawing. He made this Nymph by a Stream around 1869–70. It shows Lise Tréhaut, his model and companion at the time. Renoir appears to have struggled to represent her right leg as it bends at the knee and recedes behind her. This version of a bather dates from the late 1880s, after Renoir had spent time in Italy sketching from works by Renaissance artists and antique sculpture. The nudes that he made after this visit were more generalised, studies of bodies in different poses inspired by classical sculpture. Renoir developed his ability to compose paintings too, looking to the old masters both in the Louvre and abroad to help him to give his paintings more structure. Strong shapes locked together to form the foundation of this canvas, the umbrellas. He reworked this painting after his visit to Italy in 1881, giving some parts of it more sharply defined edges, perhaps reflecting his interest in the work of the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael. The woman and two girls at the right are in the earlier, softer style. Other figures have been clarified, more tightly modelled than before. The result is a complex, energetic composition that keeps the viewer looking, resisting easy assimilation by the eyes.
Renoir's dealer, Durand-Ruel, was however concerned about the amount of grey in his works after his trip to Italy, warning him that it did not result in the most saleable kinds of painting.
In his later years, Renoir turned to landscape painting as almost as a mode of experimentation. It was the one area where he felt most free, most unfettered, and where he allowed himself to experiment. His paintings are improvisations on the landscape. And there are no drawings, preparatory drawings for the landscapes. They're all just improvisations on canvas. Renoir's landscapes are the closest to abstraction of 19th century paintings. They are kind of endless fields of color that anticipate the formal values of non-representational painting in the 20th century.
Monet continued to focus on the landscape around him. This painting of the hamlet of Lavacourt under snow was probably made in the late 1870s when he was living at nearby Verteuil. He used some of the newly available synthetic paint colours in his vivid representation of snow as a series of violet shadows and pinkish highlights. A decade later, he had begun to make a more systematic study of particular scenes at different times of day and in varying light and weather conditions. These are just 2 of the 23 paintings that he did in 1891 of a group of poplar trees on the banks of the river Epte near Giverny, his base for the rest of his life. Monet borrowed a boat from his friend Caillebotte so that he could work on the river itself in order to get exactly the viewpoint he wanted. He even bought the trees jointly with a wood merchant when he heard that they were going to be cut down, just so that he could keep studying them for a few more months. These series paintings, as they became known, were exhibited together, making it clear just how much the light and atmosphere of any particular moment transformed a location or building. It was also a good marketing ploy. The art-buying public would eagerly await the announcement of the next series exhibition, and these paintings developed a certain cachet. Monet would eventually become an extremely wealthy man. He spent a good deal of time and money in the final part of his life on making his beautiful garden at Giverny into a kind of outdoor studio. Buying up adjacent land and diverting a nearby stream, he created a water garden filled with lilies and irises, a Japanese-style bridge spanning the pond. This would become the entire focus for his work in the final decades of his life. Perhaps Monet was standing on his bridge when he made this painting of the irises at the edge of his pond, as the viewpoint seems unusually high. His late paintings of the water garden are vast, enveloping the viewer in veils of colour that seem to shift before the eye. Ironically, the artist who had once aimed to capture quick impressions of the world had become, in his own words, a very slow worker. Pissarro also worked on several series of paintings towards the end of his life, focusing particularly on urban street scenes at different times of day. To make this painting of the Boulevard Montmartre at night from 1897, he rented a room at the Hôtel Russie, high up to give this dramatic viewpoint. He has focused his attention on the artificial glow of the electric streetlights, a recent addition to the Parisian cityscape. It is raining, and the surface of the picture seems somehow to blur and smear, as if we really are looking at this view through a water-streaked window. Pissarro wrote in a letter that year, "I am delighted to be able to paint those Parisian streets that people have come to call ugly, but which are so silvery, so luminous and vital. This is completely modern." It was Pissarro who introduced the young Georges Seurat to the Impressionist group towards the end of their period of loose collaboration. He would exhibit with them in 1886. He was fascinated by their work, but wanted to develop it in an entirely new way. Seurat would take Impressionist colour practice in a far more scientific, systematic direction.
In Seurat's Bathers, we're looking at a group of men who have presumably been working in one of the factories on the horizon in Asnières, which is today just simply a suburb of Paris, but in Seurat's day was a separate little town, not a very beautiful little place. What Seurat's done with the theme of Bathers is to take this very traditional theme and turn it into an heroic painting that uses ordinary workers as its subject, and in that way is completely revolutionary and completely changes the whole nature of the theme. Seurat made many sketches from life as he developed this work. 10 drawings and 14 oil sketches have survived.
We can see that he explored the basic forms of the riverbank, adding in men as the design progressed. Using models, he sketched figures in different poses, although at this point these are disconnected thoughts. Even clothes discarded on the grass were studied separately.
When Seurat painted this, he was still a very young man, and he hadn't yet developed the technique that we associate with him, pointillism. He went back to this painting later and added some of the dots that we always look for in his paintings. But when he first made this painting, he wasn't really working in that way. He was painting in a way that shows that he was completely familiar with Impressionism, but also with other styles of painting, that he was a great admirer of Piero della Francesca. And you can see that in this painting, in the solemnity, in the gravity with which he treats this rather ordinary subject of these workers lying on the riverbank. Seurat's training was very traditional. He trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, and that was a training that had remained unchanged for centuries, that was predicated on drawing. So unlike most of the Impressionists, his training was incredibly thorough and incredibly traditional. The Bathers was shown in really quite a small forum initially, and it didn't attract all that much attention. It was probably noticed as a young artist doing his masterpiece. That was a word with real meaning for somebody who'd been to the École des Beaux-Arts. It was where you showed that you could do a large multi-figure composition. So what was different about this was that it was a modern theme rather than historic or biblical theme.
The final version of this scene has been constructed as carefully as a Renaissance masterpiece. Seurat uses triangles to structure the space of his painting, from the slope of the riverbank to the strangely shaped trees and bushes, some of which are clearly designed to counterbalance other forms, like the sail of this boat. The curved backs of the men serve as another visual rhythm across the painting, relating these figures to one another in one sense, yet also emphasising the fact that they don't appear to connect or communicate with one another verbally at all.
Seurat was interested in contrasts, both contrasts of light and dark and contrasts of colour. And so if we look at the great bathers that we have here in the National Gallery, we can see that the main figures, where they have a lit side, it's contrasted against a dark background, and where they have a dark side, it's contrasted against a light background. And so each figure has a sort of halo around it, which you don't notice when you first look at the painting, but is very obvious once it's pointed out. Seurat was also interested in contrast of colour, and this is something that he derived from Impressionist practice. Primary colours and secondary colours, complementary colours. For example, blue and orange, green and red, which have maximum contrast for each other. And so, whereas the Impressionists, who were also aware of these contrasts of colour, would use large areas of, say, blue and orange to reinforce each other, Seurat reduced it to tiny points of colour.
These dots of colour would become the cornerstone of Seurat's divisionist or pointilliste technique. He would refine the rough dabs that we see here in this sketch from 1885, known as The Morning Walk, into more precise, delicate touches. He made this representation of the Channel of Gravelines in 1890, during a summer spent painting in this northern port near Calais.
Another artist who travelled to Paris to be part of the art scene in the 1880s was Vincent van Gogh. After an early career in his native Holland that involved both preaching and being an art dealer, a job from which he was fired, he trained as a painter and set off for Paris. He was part of the artistic community here in Montmartre. He met many artists, including Seurat, Degas and Paul Gauguin, with whom he developed a particularly strong friendship.
It was for Gauguin that Van Gogh painted his famous sunflowers. He had moved to Arles in the south of France and was overwhelmed by the vibrant quality of the light and colour he experienced every day. He urged Gauguin to join him in the yellow house that he had rented, imagining that they would work creatively together. To decorate Gauguin's room, Van Gogh made a series of paintings of sunflowers, working for long hours each day as he tried to capture the shapes of the petals surrounding the massive seed heads before each bunch died.
Perhaps because we know that Van Gogh's mental health would soon deteriorate, it's tempting to read turmoil and torment into the twisted petals of the sunflowers. But that's not how he saw this painting at all. Yellow was a colour of pure joy for Van Gogh, and this painting represented all of his hopes and enthusiasm for an extraordinary period of artistic exploration with Gauguin.
In reality, the time that the two artists spent together did not go smoothly. They were very different, a fact that Van Gogh explored in a pair of paintings of chairs, including this one. It's a self-portrait. Van Gogh's chair is a simple, sturdy affair, topped by his pipe and a twist of tobacco. The piece of furniture that represents his friend is more ornate, decoratively carved with an upholstered seat. It feels like a different class of chair from Van Gogh's, particularly with its still life of books and a candle. The reality of living and working together in such close quarters was not the idyll that either artist had imagined. They produced extraordinary paintings, but there were also fierce arguments. Van Gogh's mental health became increasingly fragile. It was after one particularly violent row that he cut off part of his left ear. Gauguin fled in horror, and Van Gogh was admitted to the asylum at Saint-Rémy. This is one of the paintings that he made there in 1889, a wheat field with cypresses. It shows that Van Gogh was interested in many of the elements that fascinated the Impressionists: light, colour, texture, landscape, and atmospheric effects. This seems primarily to be a painting of wind. Yet his bold approach to colour and mark-making shows that he had moved in a different direction, using his imagination to create a vision of the world that doesn't look exactly like anything that appears before our eyes, but which expresses certain ideas, emotions, and essential qualities with considerable power. Towards the end of his stay at the asylum, and just a few months before he committed suicide, he made this painting of a patch of long grass in the hospital grounds. Within the confines of Van Gogh's canvas, this unpromising subject matter becomes a vibrant cosmos, bursting with energy and life as butterflies hover above the spiky tufts of grass. It's almost an abstract painting, the shapes and colours becoming disassociated from an obvious representational starting point.
Gauguin's approach would also move away from naturalistic representation. He had worked with the Impressionists in the early 1880s, but felt that their paintings lacked intellectual substance.
He was particularly interested, too, in some of the areas of human experience that Impressionism had never touched upon: dreams, intense emotions, and societies that were very different from his own. Gauguin spent time in Brittany, fascinated by the lives and traditions of Breton peasants, which were utterly unlike those of modern Parisians. His representation of harvest time at Le Pouldou doesn't monumentalise the workers as Courbet or Millet had done. Instead, the landscape, people and animals are the starting point for an intensely coloured, semi-abstract meditation. The shape of the headland is a recognisable landscape feature, but other elements are not shown as they appear in real life. This bright red dog looks like a toy, placed in a dreamlike setting. It's a recurring motif that appears in different forms elsewhere in his work. This dog seems related to the dog from Le Pouldou. He is part of a canvas that represents a shifting, fragmented vision of Polynesian women, animals and luscious fruits. The search for cultural difference took Gauguin to the Caribbean in 1887 and to the South Pacific in 1891. He would stay there on the island of Tahiti for most of the rest of his life. This canvas is one of several long, narrow paintings that he made during the late 1890s, their horizontal format inspired by sculpted Javanese friezes. Some of the women he has painted here are based on sculptures, others perhaps on the real women who shared his life. But Gauguin's intention was to make suggestive images that expressed ideas symbolically rather than imitated nature directly.
As such, he was part of another loose group of artists who became known as symbolists. They took ideas about symbolic expression that had originated in French poetry and gave them a wide variety of visual forms.
Puvis de Chavannes is one of the most ambiguous figures in 19th century painting. On one side, he's the grand official artist of murals for museums and courthouses and schools. On the other hand, his work, the ways in which it evoked a timeless realm and Eden, was of great influence on the most advanced symbolist artists of the late 19th century. Gustave Moreau, in his art, goes back and draws on myth and religious imagery to create, as it were, almost an escape from the modern world back to this world of inner symbolic meaning. It's hard to imagine that Moreau approaches the subject of George and the Dragon with much religious fervor. He rather changes it into a kind of emotional or psychological confrontation of a young man and his demons.
Equally inventive were the jungle scenes of Henri Rousseau. Unlike Gauguin, Rousseau never felt the need to travel to far-off exotic lands to find inspiration for scenes like A Tiger in a Tropical Storm, Surprised. Even though Rousseau claimed that he'd seen jungles at first hand while serving in the military in Mexico in 1860, it seems far more likely that his dense vegetation was inspired by aspidistras and rubber plants that he saw in the botanical gardens in Paris. His tiger looks as if it might well have been based on a domestic cat.
Rousseau made his lack of formal training and his simple, almost childlike paintings into a virtue. Some artists and patrons were increasingly interested in what they called primitive art, art that stood outside the norms of Western representation, whether it came from an exotic African or Oceanic culture, or whether it came from the brush of an unschooled Sunday painter.
They chose to see directness, innocence, and a lack of corruption in such objects. It was a rather patronising view, and one which didn't take into account either the cultural complexity surrounding a Javanese sculpture or the careful thought behind Rousseau's work. He in fact believed that he was creating works of great art. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec had no such illusions about his work, which nevertheless pushed back the boundaries in a different area. He brought a renewed energy to the depiction of scenes of contemporary urban life, focusing in particular on the shady worlds of dancers, drinkers and prostitutes. In this work he shows the dancer Gabrielle seated in a garden, the tired lines of her face and unhealthy pallor of her skin hinting at her working life. Toulouse-Lautrec has used oil paint as if he were sketching with pastel, forming rough lines that capture perfectly her hunched shoulders. This artist spent many hours in brothels, observing prostitutes as they presented themselves to potential clients and rested between customers. This painting is entitled The Two Friends. Like many of these works, it emphasises the intimacy and support that Toulouse-Lautrec witnessed between the prostitutes. Modern life was not easy for these working women, but while he would sometimes show their exhaustion and despair, or the effects of alcoholism, he also depicted the humour, love and friendship in their lives.
Toulouse-Lautrec's work was all about Parisian life, and the city was still very much the centre of the French art world. However, the artist who arguably developed the most radically different aesthetic of the late 19th century did so hundreds of miles away from his Parisian peers. This was Paul Cézanne.
In a way, I think Cézanne never left Provence. He did go to Paris regularly, but I think he was always really happy only back in Provence. His love for that landscape is completely and utterly a part of him. It's always there in his art.
We can see from this view of a hillside in Provence that Cézanne was responding to the geometry of the landscape, from the square cuts left by an old quarry in the foreground to the patchwork of fields in the distance. His brushstrokes lay the colour down in particular directions, emphasising both the angular facets of the land and the softer curving forms of the trees and bushes. In this landscape with poplars, Cézanne found even more patterns in the landscape, experimenting with vertical and diagonal brushstrokes to suggest solidity and movement. He made this view of an avenue in the park around the Château of Chantilly during one of his trips north in 1888. The tunnel of trees has the monumental grandeur of architecture. It's as if we're walking towards a Gothic arch in a leafy open-air cathedral. Like so many artists working at this time, Cézanne too explored the theme of bathers on numerous occasions. The National Gallery's huge canvas was one of 3 large-scale compositions of bathers that occupied Cézanne's final years. He seems to have begun this one around 1900 and was still working on it when he died in 1906.
For Cézanne, modernity means something completely different from what it means for Monet or for Seurat, because it doesn't mean a contemporary place at all. His bathers are neither specifically of a moment in terms of their appearance, nor are they specifically in a place. You cannot actually identify that place. You know it's in Provence, you know it's in Aix, but where it is a mystery. For Cézanne, then, modernity means extrapolating from the specific to something that is more wide-ranging, exactly the opposite of what it meant for somebody like Monet.
This is a painting of bathers that resists the viewer's attempts to give it a narrative. If these figures are not individuals, if there is no story, if this isn't a convincing illusion of a three-dimensional space, then we can only consider what we're looking at in purely formal terms, thinking about shapes, colours, textures, light and dark. It's not entirely abstract, but it's moving in that direction. Cézanne's bathers certainly anticipated and inspired important future developments. It was exhibited in 1907, the year after his death, and both Matisse and Picasso saw it. Matisse seems to have responded in particular to the strong shapes, perhaps reflected here in his portrait of Greta Moll, made in 1908. Greta's face, hair and limbs become part of a pattern of forms, the simplicity of the surface of her skin standing out against the bold printed fabric behind her. Picasso was interested in the way that Cézanne reduced his subjects to geometric forms. He may also have noticed that some of Cézanne's bathers are shown from slightly different viewpoints. He has used multiple lines around the edge of this figure's body and has shown more of her back and bottom than you could have seen from one viewing position. This, of course, was an idea that Picasso would explore to dramatic effect in his Cubist work, an approach that he and others were just beginning to develop when Cézanne's bathers went on show. His still life of a fruit dish, bottle, newspaper and violin, made in 1914, shows these objects as basic shapes, areas of flat colour or pattern. They've been studied from different viewpoints. We can see two views of the violin strings, for example. The objects become fragmented. Glimpses of recognisable motifs and shapes signal the objects that inspired the painting, but the end result has moved a long way from that starting point. Picasso has added sand to parts of his painting to give it more texture. In a way, it recalls the grain studied into Monet's beach at Trouville, but of course the circumstances are entirely different. Picasso was not out on the beach. He was in his studio, using his imagination precisely so that he could paint something other than his direct visual experience. The work of Matisse and Picasso would come to represent what many people still today think of as modern art, namely early 20th century abstraction. But of course, if we think of how we might apply that word modernity to our own times, we can see that it's a shifting notion. It certainly conjured up a rich range of possibilities when Monet, Seurat and Cézanne decided to treat a classic theme in a modern way and made the National Gallery's unique trio of bathers' paintings. The late 19th century in France was an extraordinarily creative time. The art produced doesn't fit into neat categories or schools. Artists sometimes worked together, sharing ideas and resources, and at other points worked alone or according to very different agendas. Between them, they developed a range of new ways of representation that was unprecedented in its breadth and variety.
And this, of course, is what makes it so wonderful. As you walk around the 19th century French displays here at the National Gallery, you're surrounded by creativity, energy and modernity in a multitude of forms.